Warm good evening and welcome to the fourth Naturenomics Dialogue. First of all, thank you to all the lovely, amazing ladies who are with us now to discuss on this very important topic on putting women front and center, women for forests. Our session yesterday was on technology and innovation for managing habitats and very well highlighted on enhancing technology access for our forest fringe communities and encouraging technology education for community conservation. So while we all talk about enhancing community conservation or fostering biodiversity, it would be just impossible without addressing the key and crucial role women play in preserving and protecting our habitats and biodiversity. So our session today will focus on understanding the intersections of conservation, gender, and equality. We all know women, especially rural and indigenous women, have often been on the front lines of conservation struggles, but their voices, perspectives, and concerns often go unheard. So this session will shed some light on how we can center women's voices in conservation and how we can design better programs that respond to their concerns and do not further deepen gender inequality. So to address these very important concerns, we are truly honored to have eminent personalities with us today. We have Dr. Diana Owen, we have Karuna Singh, Tamara Law Goswami, and Trisha Ghosh. I'm sure we are all very excited to see the all-women panel who will share with us their insights on how women's voices and concerns can be centered in conversations on the environment and its restoration. I would also sincerely like to thank all our attendees for showing your interest and joining in for this session. We will be accepting a total of 5 questions for the panelists. You will see a Q&A box in your Zoom screen. So just put all your questions over there. Also, we are streamed right now live on Facebook. If you have any questions, even there, just put it in the comment section. One of our team members will bring those questions to us. Also, please be assured, in case we couldn't answer your questions because of time constraints, we shall definitely get back to you guys with the answers. With this, I would like to introduce our moderator for today's panel, Dr. Diana Owen. Dr. Diana Owen is the Director General at the Royal Overseas League, where she plays a number of senior roles in numerous Commonwealth-related bodies. She is the first woman to have held this position, as well as the first woman to have been Director and CEO at the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. In this capacity, she has grown the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust's national and international profile and reputation, leading significant cultural and capital projects in Stratford and with partners worldwide. Diana has extensive for this work and her work with the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. She was awarded an Order of the British Empire in 2018 in the Queen's Birthday Honours List. Thank you, Diana, for joining in. And I thank all our panelists for being with us. Over to you, Diana.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a great privilege to be here today and to be with these amazing women sharing this panel today. And I've been associated with the Ballypara Foundation for many years, and I'd like to thank the Foundation for organising this series of webinars. And hopefully Zoom will also allow us to reach a much wider audience through Zoom and Facebook and the other internet platforms. I am still based in the UK, and after a few general introductory remarks, I'm going to introduce our panelists, our very distinguished panelists. Each of them will be asked to speak on a given topic for about 4 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion. And we'll have 3 rounds of those. And at the end of the sessions, we will be taking questions from the audience. So I really hope you enjoyed today's session and that you will either learn something new or it will give you food for thought in the future. As we've already been told, we're focusing on putting women front and centre and women for forests today. And it is very good that we have an all-women panel, though I hope that there are some men in our audience today, because this is an issue for all of us, not just for women. But it is right to focus on women's experience, because our contribution as women is often overlooked, and often it's women that have to bear the brunt and the heaviest burden in our societies, particularly in times of crisis, as we are experiencing at the moment. The Balipara Foundation, particularly the Rural Futures Programme, has been very proactive in engaging with women in local communities. And there is much that we can learn and share from that experience as well, and from all of the experience of our panelists. So how do we ensure that we don't just listen to women, but we design programs that put women at the center of those programs? And also that we don't entrench gender equality, which is still such an issue for societies all around the world when we design programs for the future. So I'm going to now introduce our distinguished panelists, starting with Karuna from the Earth Day Network, who's the country director of the Earth Day Network India. And Karuna has worked towards building awareness around environmental and climate change issues across a wide spectrum of audiences. As a senior executive in the State Department's US consulate in Kolkata for over 2 decades, she has organized many seminars, film screenings and workshops and other events to educate and inspire the youth of our nation to work for the environment. Her work area covers the 12 states of East and Northeastern India, and she has helped initiate several cross-border programs on subjects like coastal zone management, and is currently the country director for the Earth Day Network, which is the world's largest environmental movement. She's also one of the few activists who have been mentored by the acclaimed activist Al Gore to advocate on climate change issues. Welcome, Karuna.
Thank you.
Trisha Ghosh from the Habitats Trust is project director for the Habitats Trust, which the Trust works towards protecting habitats and their indigenous species. She is part of a strategic team shaping the Trust's activities and engagements. As an avid lover of wildlife and the forests, Trisha has spent close to a decade working on conservation issues in India. Over the span of her career, Trisha has worked with some of India's premier conservation organizations, including World Wildlife Fund India and the Wildlife Protection Society of India. Trisha has worked on a myriad of conservation issues, including human-wildlife conflict, poaching and illegal trafficking in wildlife parks, habitat loss and fragmentation, conservation awareness generation, and support to forest fringe communities. Welcome, Trisha.
Thanks, Diana.
We have Tamara Goswami, who has worked in environmental science and management space for the last 20 years. Early in her career, she worked on pollution prevention and control for industries, and then moved into renewable energy systems. In the 2013 to 14, she was part of the Terry team working on the then Prime Minister's Council on Climate Change to identify nationally appropriation mitigation actions for India. Before moving to the Northeast, she worked with a social enterprise in sustainable agricultural systems and chemical-free food. A nature lover at heart, she finds herself involved more and more in education and awareness relating to issues of sustainability and conservation in Northeast India today. Welcome, Tamara. Well, what an excellent panel we have for our sessions today. So I think the opening round, we're going to be discussing how do we nurture women leaders, especially women leaders among rural and indigenous communities, to lead community conservation programs, and how do we amplify their voices so that they can talk confidently about environmental issues, and how do we give those ladies, those women, a platform? So I'm not going to go around in any particular order, but we'll start this round with Karuna. If you would like to start, Karuna, and then Trisha, and then finally Tamara, and then we'll alternate between rounds. So Karuna.
Thank you, Diana, and good evening to all. And I'm Karuna, as Diana was mentioning. I'm the Regional Director for Earth Day Network, the organizers of Earth Days over the last 50 years since inception. And we do work with and through organizations, as our name has, we are a network. So we have 70,000 organizations in 190 countries that we work with and through, and proud to say that we have worked with Balipara Foundation, and they've been wonderful partners, really. So when we come to women, it's a given that women have a very great relationship with forests, which they see as benefactors, a biodiversity system, which is a benefactor to them. They provide them the forest produce, which they can use. And in their turn, they love the trees, they protect the trees, they look after the trees, and they are often the first responders if they spy any poaching, that is, any poachers that are there. But over the years, their voices have always been muffled because they haven't had economic independence, which gave them the strength to stand up and speak their mind. And societies have bound them to roles of standing quietly as observers and not as decision makers. But I'm glad to say today that these things are changing. First of all, if you take our panchayat system, it's taken them decades for the women. We have 33% reservations over there. Some states have 50 also, which is very good. But it's taken the women decades to make their own decisions because they've been sitting on those seats as puppets, the strings of which are in the hands of their menfolk. But today, if you look at women panchayat leaders, they are there, they can make their own decisions, and Earth Day Network has been running special workshops for these women panchayat leaders where we explain to them something that seems convoluted to them, like a watershed management or rainwater system. And we bring to them also the many government schemes that are available, which they could use to implement environment-friendly decisions. So this is one thing which is a positive that is happening, and we should encourage it even more. The second positive I see is that you can muffle a single voice, but when it comes to women speaking in unison together, as they do by forming self-help groups, then those voices are to reckon with. And these self-help groups have developed over the years, providing women not just occupation to do something environment-friendly, but also to raise their livelihood. So what Earth Day Network does is we recognize some of these smaller groups. We don't go for the larger groups because they get their recognition in any case, but we work with smaller groups to recognize them. For instance, we have the Aranya Sundari Mahila Mahasangha in Jharkhand that uses salpatta leaves to make plates as alternatives, biodegradable alternatives to plastic. Or we have the Sarojini Gram Mahila Vikas Sanstha in Chhattisgarh. Now, Chhattisgarh is very unique because out of the 8,000 species, herbal species that the government has recorded, about 1,500 are over here. And that's why this state has a lot of these Vaidyas or herbal healers. And that's been a tradition to do so. But women were kept out of that, I don't want to call it a business, but that occupation, although they had the same knowledge, because they could not work on the fields alongside men. That was a taboo. But now sangsthas like these have come up where these are women inclusive, and women are working together, replicating what the men are doing, and are able to earn out of that as well. So the third thing that has come up is that in 2002, we had the Biological Diversity Act that mandates the preparation of the People's Biodiversity Register. So here again, because women are the ones who really go more often to the forest than men do, women are being encouraged to play a bigger role. So I'll stop there, and maybe we can think of other things as things come along. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karuna. Trisha, could I ask you now to comment on this subject of women's voices and conservation?
So one of the things that bothers me a little bit right now in our current situation, that all work for or with women is currently defined as women empowerment. This is not always correct, and we need to start looking a lot more carefully at how we define women empowerment. some of the tools that we can use to empower women within our conservation field and the work that we do, for example, is to start valuing the unique gender specific knowledge that these rural women have. As primary users of our natural resources, they have a unique connection to these natural resources, as well as traditional knowledge on how to sustain them, use them sustainably, as well as to conserve them. But this knowledge has never been documented, and there's very little research done on it. And so far, we've relied on oral communication to pass this knowledge down. One of the tools we need to utilize is to document these huge amounts of knowledge, so that we can, in a cohesive way, put it together and express to larger communities the value addition that these women bring to conservation planning, and promote their greater involvement in conservation planning. Moreover, I think once we start documenting this knowledge, it'll also make women themselves realize that the power that they have within them. I believe that a lot of rural women do not really understand the unique knowledge base that lies within them. And this hasn't been tapped into sufficiently. I think one of the tools, again, we can use to actually make women more confident and get larger involvement of women in programs is mentorship. It's one of the things we tend to overlook, but have long female mentors who have gone through the struggles that they are facing in their daily lives and have managed to overcome those obstacles really form inspirational to rural women. And one of the ways that we've been exploring doing this is to set up exposure visits for women from indigenous and grassroots communities to visit women leaders from other grassroots communities. Once they can go and real life examples of these women who have faced all the same challenges as them and are now standing in positions of power, making decisions for their communities, their receptiveness to our programs is a lot more, as well as their self-belief is a lot more, which makes the programs more successful in the long run. So I'll leave it at that and let Tamara continue.
Thank you very much, Trisha. Tamara, sorry. Trisha, Trisha and Tamara, can I turn to you now, sorry, to also consider this question of women's voices and women's experience and how we value it as well, which we were just discussing there.
Sure. Thank you, Diana. I think I agree with Trisha in what she said about traditional knowledge and wisdom that women own that is not acknowledged. And even when designing programs, we tend to look at bigger pictures rather than digging down a little deeper and looking into social structures, looking into using a very gendered lens to evaluate how forests are used. You know, the same resource, we were chatting earlier, all of us, before this started, and Diana mentioned a tree. And to a woman, a tree is so many things. It could be sacred, it could be fuel wood, it could be food, it could be fodder for her animals, her needs. But for a man, it might just be timber that needs to be sold, and that's a one-off thing. Whereas for a woman, it's a more sustainable, long-term thing. So what I agree with what Trisha said, that's one area where we need to dig deeper when designing our programs, and in order to make sure that the community at large understands the contribution of women. Right now, especially in fringe communities, rural communities, and we're talking women in forests today, so a lot of these women come from marginalized communities. It's very difficult for them to raise their voices, and no one's helping them to understand what their place really is and what their contribution is. So I think that's important. The other thing that I really think is important is working with men to work with women. And so many of our programs focus on women. And while I understand the need to do that when it comes to certain things like violence against women and certain types of discrimination, etc., for which there are legal processes and legal outlets to address these things, when we're designing programs and when we're actually trying to empower women, we need to be sure that everyone's on board, not just a woman warrior out there being aggressive and male-like, but a strong woman who's using her feminine strengths in, like what would feminine strengths be, or flexibility, or ability to perceive a story or a situation from so many different angles, are nurturing spirits. How do we use these, and how do we harness these to make women a lot stronger in the community? So I think working with men and helping them understand these things, and then men to say, hey, your woman is not just someone who's at home for free labor, but maybe you could help her by supporting her in the home, allowing her to upgrade her skills outside of the home, acknowledging the contribution she makes with children, with the economy of care, so children and old people, etc., etc. So it's a very mixed bag. But if we look at women leading conservation programs, I think we need to go a step further than that. And when we talk of education, again, community education, we need to look at it in a very differentiated way. Women need to understand their rights. They need to be empowered by knowing that there are systems and processes that are checks and balances for them if they walk down a path that they've not walked down before. So understanding their rights is very important, but then also understanding ecological processes, maybe scientific things like Karuna mentioned, where maybe they don't understand something about a watershed development program, which is in their area, and giving them that knowledge and that information so that they're able to use this to their advantage. The other thing is women in general, especially from marginalized communities, do not seem to have the strength or the power to negotiate. They do not have negotiating skills except in the home, where they're very good at it. But if there's a public platform, they tend to lose that spirit all of a sudden. So how do you negotiate with the powers that be? And how do you interact with and understand administrative and legal processes, even your own forest department, or even your Gram Panchayat head? Let's build capacity with women, for women, to understand how to negotiate these situations. And therefore, we provide very enabling spaces. This 33% or 50% reservation on committees, etc. Honestly, on the ground, it's not meant too much, except in a handful of cases where it's working wonderfully, but that's because there have been other factors involved. But as a straitjacket thing, is something that's just, okay, this is the law and 33% women need to be there. They're just representative. So it's more representative democracy rather than a true democracy where women are representing themselves. So I think, yes, in a nutshell, that's where I'm coming from for this discussion.
Thank you very much. Three very interesting contributions there, but I think there was a common theme that you were all kind of discussing from different perspectives, which was around the confidence that women have in their own value, and how do we build that up? How do we give women the confidence? Because I know even in my own life, I have often felt very unconfident, if there's such a word, lacking in confidence sometimes. And it's, it's taken me years and years and years, and I've had all the benefits of wealth and privilege and education. And so how do we build women's confidence and esteem, really, and pride in what perhaps we take for granted sometimes? Should we start with Tamara this time?
Sure, Diana. I think I'll just take off from where I left off last time, addressing the gaps right now that women are facing. So when we're designing community programs and when we're trying to empower women, this whole thing of understanding their roles, and honestly, it's so different community to community. There's no one size fits all, and every community program needs to really dig deeper into what are those gender differences. So also taking a step back from there, because sometimes there are sociological and cultural issues that stop women from doing what they're doing. There may be an issue of local alcohol, so lots of alcoholic husbands. They may be living close to borders, so there's a drug problem in the community. So not looking at it as just an environmental issue, but also looking at it as a societal issue that needs to be addressed, maybe will help women have confidence to know that, okay, someone understands us. We're not sitting in the dark alone. There's someone who knows what we're all about. So, hey, maybe there's a chance here. And many of our programs miss a grievance redressal system. There's no place for women to say, hey, this is the law and this is what you'll have said, but it's not working that way. We might notice it, we might observe it in our own, when we evaluate programs on the ground, but it's very rare that the women in the community actually come up to us and say, hey, this is not working the way you planned it. So it's important to empower them with the strengths, and two ways to do that. One is to show them that you care by having a system that actually works. And the other one is with knowledge. And knowledge is a very basic thing. We'll do it anyway. Their rights, their relationship to ecological relationships, societal relations, etc. But the more important thing is to show them that, hey, there is this cell, or there is this person, or there is this social mobilizer in your community that's going to take care of your issues. And it doesn't matter if it's as simple as my husband doesn't listen to me when I talk to him. It can be as simple as that to something as big as, hey, I said this in the meeting today, but the Gram Panchayat head was not happy about it because we'll get more money from logging timber. What do you think I should do? And we need to encourage those sorts of conversations rather than just sticking to the black and white of program design.
Yes. Yes. And Karuna, you were talking about the Panchayat leaders and that some of these are now women. From your experience, how has that happened? How's that come about?
The government and a lot of NGOs, I give a lot of NGOs credit because they have gone to these women and they have, Tamara, taught them how to, stand up for their own rights and do things like that. So I've had some happy experiences. Like, I went to Bagli in Madhya Pradesh, and there was this woman leader. She was a tyrant. She could stand up and ask for things. And what is wonderful is that in the Panchayat system, they are elected for 5 years. So they're not worried about the opposition pulling the rug from under them. So it gives them time to go and do what they have to do, but they need to be educated or refocused on these issues so that they make environmentally friendly decisions. So I think that is important. And if I were to say that what is important to get women to stand up for themselves, I firmly believe that financial independence is very important. In fact, it's not just women in the rural areas. I would say even urban women. It's very important. And that's why at one stage I had decided that whatever I had, I would leave it to my daughter. If she wanted to get married, she could. If she wanted to leave her husband, she could. She should have that financial stability to make her decision. So this, I find that, when you look at women, those who earn and bring something home, they are respected at home as well. It's unfortunate, but that is how it is. And secondly, I would say that let's educate the men. It's so, Tamara, exactly what you were saying. I think it's so important to make men realize that women are 50% of the population. And if you really want to progress, you can't leave them out from there. I would take this further and say, let the Bollywood actors show how macho they are by protecting women, by talking about their grandmothers who, told them stories about the fields that they worked in, or the seeds that they had planted, or crops that came out, because women are really repositories of knowledge over there. Let the older generation dig back into scriptures and bring out the roles, the strong roles that women played. So in this brief time that we've had, a couple of centuries, we have just forgotten all that. But actually, Indian women are strong women. So let's make them strong again.
Thank you, Karina. And Trisha, I know you mentioned about the lack of valuing, really, of women's knowledge and experience, and about women themselves not even valuing what they have innately, or what they learn through their lives.
Right. So to begin with, I think the most important thing is to get these women to start understanding the knowledge bank that they have. We very often tend to go into rural communities on the preconceived notion that we know more than they do. That could not be more incorrect. We have very different types of access to knowledge and information. So yes, our understandings differ, but we are in no way more knowledgeable or less knowledgeable. And one way to start getting women to really understand the value of the knowledge that they have is for us to come in and learn from them. We need to start developing our conservation plans, not sitting in head offices in metropolitan cities, but rather on ground, once we've actually spent time with communities and understood what they have to offer, the cultural nuances, the economical and ecological nuances to their way of life. And in that way, once we show them that we also need to learn from them and their inputs will help us better plan, they will start realizing that yes, they need to start speaking up, because their voices will actually improve yields, it'll improve economic situations, it'll have multiple positive effects. So that's one thing. And yes, just building upon what Karuna said, giving these women an income gives them a voice, it gives them a sense of value. But what we must be careful of is, at the moment we have very good programs to generate livelihoods for women and incremental income and credit schemes, but very little is looked into from the side of how this additional income is really being controlled and utilized at the household level. For us to create long-term and sustainable improvement in women's roles and giving them proper empowerment as in a voice and in decision making, we have to have through and through programs. Livelihood should start with income generation and end with really understanding how this is utilized and changing the way that funds in a household are constantly controlled and allocated by male representatives. That's the tricky part. How do we change the way households are functioning in the rural communities? So that's just some points I wanted to add.
No, that's very helpful, Trisha. Thank you. Because actually, it's a great way into our next round of discussion, which I think we've kind of begun to talk about anyway. It's about how we can better design community conservation programs to ensure that women are co-creating those programs and are leading the decision-making role within them. And how do we eliminate or mitigate the barriers of gender equality? And we've also touched on the financial inequalities that many women suffer as well. And we wanted to also touch on, which I think you've just done, Trisha, is about that control of the income of funds within the family unit, and women's concerns as well for their families. So I know we've sort of covered some of this, but I'm sure there are more points that you would all like to make about the design of community conservation programs and that idea of co-creation, and that it's not necessarily the NGOs that have all the knowledge and the answers when it comes to designing these programs. So we'll go around in a different order this time. We'll start with Tamara, and then we'll go to Trisha, and then Karuna. So Tamara, over to you.
Thanks, Diana. So I think I've basically covered some of the foundational aspects of what I wanted to talk about, but maybe in this area where it comes to design of community programs, we tend to rely heavily, you cannot rely on one institution itself to drive something. It has to be eventually owned wholly and fully by the community, but the community itself does not live in isolation. So we're forced to work with so many other players, whether it's government, whether it's other administrative type people, whether it's NGOs, tourists, you name it. So I think policy in this case plays quite an important role, and we need to be quite cognizant of policy in this case. So where is the gap between what is happening on the ground? For example, a lot of how a community lives and how their lives are very different to how a law may see it and decide to regulate it. Or again, going back to women see forests differently to men. It's the same resource, it's the same landscape, but viewed so differently by a man and a woman. viewed so differently with different cultural practices. So as when we design community programs, how is policy helping us here? And if there are big gaps, how are we in turn informing policy or updating policy to address these things? Those are the things that I would like to look at if I was designing a community program, because it's like I said, it's not all on the shoulders of one organization. I think that's where I'd start.
And how does it work at the moment, Tamara, in terms of how policy is generated or developed?
So policy in general is pretty perfect in the books. We have the FRA and we have many other things in place, but for a zillion different reasons, it doesn't work quite that way. And again, there are only a handful of wonderful examples where these things are working. So our implementation is extremely poor. And that comes down to a few different things. One is, again, people not being aware of their rights, etc., and therefore being open to exploitation and open to further marginalization. The other big problem in our country, which goes without saying, is corruption, and that comes at so many different levels, and we just cannot turn away from it. And a woman, unfortunately, in her home, it's the man's voice that is stronger. So if the man says, no, I will go with the illegal logging of timber, even if it means that this part of the land goes and therefore your water resource is compromised, he's not looking at it long term like the woman is. So policy is not supporting these things on the ground right now. It's rather a wide net. And yes, if you dig deep, and yes, if again people's movements take up causes on a case-to-case basis, these things can get sorted and these things are looked at closer. But in a general sense, it's weak. There are too many loopholes and there's too much corruption.
Thank you, Tamara. And Trisha, from your experience, how would you address this issue of the gap between policy and what happens on the ground and the design of conservation programs?
Absolutely. So as Tamara very rightly pointed out, we do have great policies in place, but those haven't translated onto the ground reality. And so I'd just like to start with an example of something that struck me while I was working. We were recently working in Nagaland with 26 community conserved areas. And we thought it was a great success that we got these 26 community conserved areas to start demarcating their CCAs, creating biodiversity guidelines, and as well as rules on what is allowed and not allowed within those CCAs. But then I personally went and saw the reality on ground, and there was little to no inputs from women taken into developing these guidelines. Thankfully, we caught this early in the program and we did mitigate that. And in the next part of this conversation, I'll just cover how we tried to mitigate that. But it was shocking to me because these women are probably going to be the most affected by these new guidelines, because they'll have to go longer distances as well as spend more time to collect natural resources, be it your fuel wood or your water or your medicinal plants. And this is time that's being taken away from them, which could also be spent on income generation activities or on education. So we need to start taking their voices into account as perhaps the most influenced and affected by the policies that we make. So some of the ways we tried to do this, and we kind of looked at a two-pronged approach. The first is how we were running our meetings and our planning meetings. So here again, it's a double-edged sword. If your meeting is too large, women's voices go unheard. They're less likely to speak up during the meetings. And on the other hand, if you have a women's only meeting, you tend to exclude the needs and priorities of the larger community. So how do you find a midway point or a balance? One great way to try and do that is to, within these larger meetings, which engage all your stakeholders, have little focus groups. It gives opportunities for people to break out into smaller groups. And in these smaller groups, women are more confident and more likely to speak openly and honestly. The second very important consideration when we're actually on these community meetings and gatherings and get-togethers is the time and location of these meetings. We tend to dictate the time and try to pick a location dependent on how many people we can fit into a hall, or what is the quality of this hall. Would people feel good about coming in here? But I think much more important consideration, ask the community, when do you have the time to attend this meeting, so that it doesn't overlap with your household chores. And having these meetings in closer proximity to their homes also encourages women to attend the meetings, because their husbands are more okay with them leaving, because they're spending less time away from their housework. So those are some of the ways we've tried to improve women's participation in this planning process, as well as creating these little focus groups within our larger meetings to encourage them to voice their opinions and concerns.
Thank you, Trisha. That was a really good, some practical examples there of what we can do to improve women's engagement. And then finally, Karuna, in terms of that development of policy and programs, would be very useful to have your perspective.
So I would agree with both Trisha and Tamara that we do have good policies, but there is a fuzzy line of control, because the forest department is really in charge of the forests, but it is, I think, the community that has a wider role to play in protecting the forests. And in some areas, they are allowing the communities to take on that role. But otherwise, it is the forest department that is in charge of forests. And so I think we should really fuse the two together, so that they both have responsibility of taking it forward, and not just the forest department doing so. Again, there are a lot of very good government programs that are there on paper, but they remain in offices and in ledgers, but they don't reach the beneficiaries. So it needs people like organizations, like NGOs, like all you leaders, to bring these to the beneficiaries. For instance, there is the forest management committees. Not many know that if women form a group, they can get benefits from the forest management committee. They can be paid to look after the plants that are planted so that they reach a certain maturity. But on an individual level, you can't do that. Thirdly, I think that since time is short, we should really connect women within districts, within states, within regions, so that they learn from each other's examples rather than keeping on reinventing the wheel, wasting time doing so. So if one panchayat or one community says that, this is what has worked for us, why can't we share that with others? And nowadays, most women or most communities have mobile phones. So could we form a network by which they can, talk to each other, learn from each other, even sitting at home doing that? So that's what I think.
That's a great suggestion, Karuna, because I think Trisha was also talking about role models and mentoring, and that sharing directly between women and communities. So as you say, I think most people do have access these days to a mobile phone or some type of phone connection. So would that be something, Karuna, that you would see an NGO leading on, or?
The problem with NGOs is they need some basic funds to do it. So the work is there, but the funds are not. So if there is a funder who is to come forward to do it, we'd be very happy to do so. We've already worked in about 10 states with women over there, and we do put together ebooks, which we've put free on the net for others to see examples of. Maybe Trisha remembers the last one that was, that was inaugurated at the Balipara Foundation, which was on Protect Our Species. And all of them have unique stories or ways people have been successful, but they also include the hiccups they had. So in each of the cases, we've asked them to put the hiccups there so that nobody else goes that same route. And they also have the information of that organization with the name of the person, so that these are just, written to grab your attention. But if you want the technicality for it, you can go and do that. So in our way, we try to do it, but we just an NGO. We're not a large corporation. that can do it. But of course, we would be happy to do it if there was some way of doing it.
Maybe some large corporation or funder is listening to our webinar this afternoon and might be inspired to support some of these ideas and initiatives. We've just got time, I think, for our last round of discussions, and thank you all for keeping very well to our timing. So our third area of discussion, if I can find it, I think was really perhaps based on your own experience. How can we better combat the gender inequalities for women working professionally in this sector or in the field of conservation, whatever those barriers are? And I'm sure you've all got experience of examples of gender inequality in your areas. So let me just make sure I'm doing this very fairly. So I think it would be Trisha going first this time.
So I must admit, I've been very fortunate to have always worked for very powerful women. And I think that's what I'd like to start with, actually, and it's made my journey in the conservation spectrum much easier, because all these great mentors that I had always made sure that I was involved in the decision-making process within our organizations, as well as took that extra time out to really train me when I was younger to understand the nuances of conservation. So again, I feel like even when we're looking at organizational structures, mentorship is very important. And I think one of the biggest areas where we tend to underestimate women in organizations is during field work. I mean, even as women, sometimes we look at our colleagues and we say, okay, she's small, okay, she's young. She may not be suited to field activities. We must give women the opportunity to decide for themselves what they are and are not capable of. I can personally tell you, I've gone on treks with my male colleagues where they've told me, no, you should sit this one out. You're a bit tiny. And I have walked further and faster than them, at points telling them, come on, catch up, we have further to go. So I think we need to really understand that our physical abilities, we're the best judge of them. And we must be given the option and the opportunity to decide what we want to do with our time, what we feel we're capable of carrying out. On the other hand, also, we shouldn't force ourselves to prove a point to go into situations that we are not comfortable with. I mean, it's an intricate balance. I think it's a balance women play, not just in the field of conservation, but in every aspect of our life. What are we capable of, and really tapping into that internal power. And coming back to what I began with, the biggest tool that has helped me really be where I am today and learn it along the line in the 1 decade that I've been working in conservation is the great female mentors I had in this field, who really took out the time to train me, to help me understand the nuances of how organizations work and how conservation can be connected to strong organizational structures. And I thank them for where I am today. And I hope there'll be a day when I can pass on the skills that I've learned from my great mentors to the next generation.
Fabulous. Thank you, Trisha, very much. Tamara, from your experience, what would be your message, I suppose?
Oh, Tamara, you're on mute.
Hang on, I don't know how to unmute you. I tell you what, let's go to Karuna, because you're not on mute. Oh no, Tamara, it's all right, you're unmuted now.
Right. So I think I've not been as fortunate as Trisha. I haven't had very strong women mentors. I have guests in very traditional organizations sometimes, or sometimes just with when I've gone about something activities, etc. You come up against the male ego, you come up against the male need for control, and sometimes male affection as well. And I'm a pretty small male woman, and I look pretty tiny. But it just makes them think, okay, this one's a walkover. And then when I start speaking, I think initially they're surprised, and then some of them just don't take it that well at all. And the funny thing is, and this is something that I think we all have to deal with, is it's not just men who do this to women in workplaces, but it's women as well.
Exactly.
And
Yes.
I've faced it a lot from other women.
Absolutely.
So the men, honestly, I can handle with facts and figures and logic, but the women I cannot handle with these things. So I've had a slightly different experience to that of Trisha, but what has worked for me always, one is work with facts. The second is be sure about your responsibilities and your limitations. And the third is the quality of work that you do, because I think that speaks for itself. So in the long run, it's hard for people to point fingers at facts and figures and quality of work. And this is without losing your sense of self. I don't need to suddenly become He-Man or, suddenly grow a pair of horns or anything else. It's, we just, I think we need to be ourselves and find strength from within ourselves to be the best of ourselves. And in the long run, it does work.
Yes. And Karuna, I could hear you agreeing very strongly there about sometimes the challenge of working with women.
Yes. I agree with Tamara totally, because I've had the experience of very strong colleagues who are men who have really supported me and, brought me right up in front and said, of course you can do it. And I've had the equal, on the other side, I've had the experience of women wanting to, sort of pull you down. And the most common thing to say is, oh, she's just an attractive face. It's not that she's capable, I mean, that sort of a thing is quite, in fact, I wanted to ask, how is the mother-in-law's scene in Assam, if I may ask that question, in the rural areas. And I wanted to ask, if I may, another question, and that is about the food habits. Because if I live in Calcutta, I'm a Punjabi, but I did a study once where, you saw that the Bengalis, the food that they eat is all cooked. Nothing is pre-cooked. Like the Punjabis can have yogurt with a paratha and pickle, but in the Bengali thing, there's no such concept. Even if you have a chutney, it has to be freshly made. So everything is, so the woman is kept tied to the kitchen much more than she is in other states. So I'm wondering how that is in Assam. Is it the same, which gives them less time to go out and do the other things that they could do?
Tamara or Trisha, or food preparation?
Maybe I'll go first, Diana. I'm not Assamese, but my husband is. And honestly, I don't know if it's because of the circles that we move in that my experience is this, or because this is Assam in general, but I've found women enjoy quite a bit of independence in general. Not in indigenous communities. It's still very patriarchal. There's a lot of violence against women, etc. But at least in somewhat in our circles, I find a lot of men love to cook, and they're all Assamese. So I don't cook. He's the one who cooks in the house, and so I don't know. I think Assam is a mixed bag, but definitely for marginalized communities and indigenous folk, the traditional role is still very much.
Thank you, Tamara. Trisha, what was your experience of that question?
Well, I have not spent much time in Assam personally, so I don't know how much I can talk about the food that they cook. But I mean, if you'll allow me to talk for a minute about food production. So traditionally, Assam used to have shifting agriculture, where there's no land ownership and no clear gender roles. So women enjoyed a much higher status than in other parts of the country. And since the introduction of settled agriculture, women, the gender roles are very clearly defined, and women are rarely landowners, and that is one of the premises of settled agriculture. So now women have gone from having a part to play in the processing, packaging, storage of food that's produced to just playing roles as agricultural labor. And that's one of the big ways that even programs, like well thought out programs that are looking to conserve biodiversity while also increasing agricultural yield, tend to be gender blind to the various ways that it'll affect the woman on ground. Coming to pre-cooked versus cooked food, I, as a Bengali and as someone who spends a fair bit of time in Assam, I've seen that the food is more or less similar. Like the basic way that we eat is very similar. We're very passionate about our non-vegetarian food for sure. Again, the pickles are very similar to what I see in the Bengali household. And yes, they are freshly cooked and you need to eat them almost immediately. So if that answers Karuna's question in some way, I hope.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Karishma, do we have any
Yes,
questions
excuse me,
from
and
the
I
audience?
apologize for interrupting. That was
Yeah.
thank you everyone. Like each and every point highlighted has made this session very, very interesting. And it also like very well highlights what Balipara Foundation's Rural Futures program is actually looking at. So with this, I think we can move ahead with some of the questions that have come in. Our first question, I think we can divide this question. So it's, what and how do you think the young women working in wildlife and conservation area to create their own niche? Because with the central government paying their cards in the environment arena, where majority of the time nature is not respected, how do you think Indian women being strong is becoming a backseated thought? How do the collective support of women sitting in power can pull the younger women forward? So anyone who would like to answer this question?
I think this is Trisha's, right?
Okay, I'm happy to take this. I guess this has come to me because I'm young, huh, Karuna?
Oh no, you talked about mentors and everything, and they're asking how the other women can pull the other up. So.
I'm pulling your leg. I'm just pulling your leg. So yeah, I think it's really been very heartening. So at the Habitats Trust, we also run a grants program. And just last year, we introduced what we call the Conservation Hero Grant. And in its opening year, we had 4 finalists for the grant, out of which 3 were women. And young women who are leading conservation action in their own areas.
Very good.
And so I believe one thing we can do is definitely document the efforts of these women on ground, who more often than not are working on shoestring budgets and purely out of grit and passion to really change the way action is taking place. And the other thing that I've also seen with young women in conservation, especially if you look at the various campaigns that are currently running in the country, whether it be in the Northeast to preserve large tracts of forest that are now under threat, or similarly in the Western Ghats. These are being led by young women in conservation, and their voices are loud and they are not going to be silenced. And that is most important. And most of these women, if you look at them, and I'm fortunate to know some of them, have had great mentors and both male and female mentors who've encouraged them to speak out, given them a platform to speak out. So most importantly, as you were mentioning, Karishma, what can women in position of powers do for young conservationists is to create platforms where their efforts can be documented and shared with the masses, as well as providing them platforms where their voices will be heard and valued.
I'd just like to add something here, if I may, Karishma.
Yeah, sure. Please go ahead.
This from an organization that I'm very closely associated with. That's the Green Hub, run by Rita Banerjee, which is it's a joint effort of Northeast Network and Dusty Foot Productions. And what they do is every year is they take in 10 or 20 rural youth from across the Northeast, and they actually train them in photo and video documentation and the basics of conservation, ecology, environment. And these kids actually go back after a year empowered with their newfound skills and document stories on the ground from their areas. So traditional knowledge systems, conservation issues, elders storytelling, and wisdom of old kind of thing. And the Green Hub program has been extremely successful in empowering these youth from rural India. I mean, a lot of the wildlifers we see today, and a lot of the ones that are in filmmaking, etc., have made a name for themselves. They've already had a somewhat privileged background. Maybe not 100% of them, but they all come from backgrounds of having studied well or been to lovely colleges, their parents have the wherewithal to get them through doing whatever they want to do to follow their dreams. But in this case, it's actually a case of Rita and her team empowering rural women. And it's not just women, there are men, of course, there are boys as well who are part of this program, but the women are doing wonderfully, and you can see the efforts on the ground. So I just thought I should add that as something that's been done in the Northeast.
Thank you, Trisha. Thank you, Tamara. So I think we can take our next question. So our next question is, how can we ensure that women take the lead in ensuring land rights for communities, taking power away from the forest department and to communities where it belongs? So maybe Karuna?
I think they have to just fight for it in a collective voice. That's the only way out, you know. Single voices are not going to make a difference. So you have to fight in a collective voice. You have to get journalists to write about it. Media is very powerful. So whether it is the social media or television or, you know, print media, I think that they can be great supporters. And then you have organizations like Balipara Foundation who might take up the cause, or you have Sanctuary Asia, another one of our partners, who also do tremendous work. So it's not an effort that can get success by small groups or single voices. It has to be a collective action.
Thank you, Karuna. So our next question is, when there is loss of biodiversity, women are the first sufferers because they will have to devote more time in collection of water, fuel, wood, etc. And this in turn reduces the time they can spend on income generating activities and education. So how do we overcome this for the indigenous women? So who would like to go? Maybe Trisha, you want to go for it?
Sure, I'm happy to cover that because I think I started that conversation. So as I had mentioned then, it's very important that we start getting women to be more active and involved in the decision-making process. And that's easier said than done actually in reality, because for too long, women have been subdued and their voices have not been valued. So how do we change that entire process of socialization? So I think one of the important things is when we're creating women empowerment programs, as much as we focus on women and giving them a voice and giving them the tools to be decision makers, it's equally important, as both Tamara and Karuna have mentioned during the talk, to focus on men and especially young boys. We need to change the socialization of young boys in rural communities because they've been trained in patriarchy and to believe that oppression of women is normal. So that's the first thing that needs to change, as well as we need to help them understand the value and the knowledge that these women have and can bring to the table to improve their economic status as a community at large, not just in biodiversity conservation. And that's when their voices may begin to be heard and hopefully will begin to be heard.
Karuna, maybe you want to add to it something?
Yeah, I would go back to the point I made. Get these Bollywood actors or sports personalities to hold up these women as examples and say, I support them. Look at the lovely work they're doing. You know, we are a society where it matters so much. If somebody says that, you know, I have a bucket bath, then everyone's going to have a bucket bath. So time is short. Let's go with these stars and let's get them. I mean, it's their duty, I think, you know, because it's going to benefit them as well. We are all earthlings. We don't live in areas that are not connected. The whole world is connected. Look at what COVID-19 has done. There are 190 countries that are all, COVID positive. So if there is any, if there's any doubt about the fact that the earth is connected, COVID has shown you that it is. So let's not tell them that you're doing it as a special favor for anyone, but you're doing it for yourself.
Thank you, Karuna. Thank you, Trisha. So I think we'll just quickly take the last question, and then Diana can maybe summarize the session. Okay, so the last question is, it's come up several times that men need to be involved deeply in this process of nurturing women leaders. Going beyond education, how can we structure programs to encourage this, especially for men to see women as equal leaders and stakeholders? Yeah, so who would like to answer that?
Maybe tomorrow, because she's had
I
less
don't
time.
mind first, yeah. So I think the first thing would be for men to start acknowledging women's contribution, and I think I touched on this earlier when I was talking about giving them credit for what it is that they do at home, the economy of care, what they do for energy systems in their home, what they do for water. These are all very basic things, and for them to acknowledge that when these don't exist, what's the alternative? And the other very important thing I think that maybe we've not really touched on in this discussion is how we view common food resources and property thereof. So women, even in a place like Meghalaya, it's matrilineal, so the woman owns the land, etc. But that doesn't mean it's matriarchal. It still just means that on paper the woman owns the land, but the trading and the value of the land and whatever happens on the land, even if a woman is the one cultivating the land, etc., the trade value and the product value of the land goes back to the man, because traditionally men are seen as protectors and enforcers, and women are just seen as being somewhere in the background. So I think somewhere for us to re-look at how we view property, maybe as more relational rather than objectifying property, just like we objectify women. Maybe that's one thing to look at. And the other thing is definitely education. And I use the word education loosely because I'm not talking about math and physics and chemistry. I'm talking about socio-ecological and socio-economic, a sort of a developmental education. Yeah.
Thank you, Tamara. So Diana, maybe you would like to summarize the session?
Sure, that would be great. It's a shame to have to end this session, but thank you to Tamara, to Trisha, to Karuna. Really fascinating, inspiring as well, and very insightful from your experience. Very rich contributions. I think the things that have really stood out for me, I mean, it's difficult to summarize the whole thing, but the importance of role models and mentors and of collective action, the importance of platforms, and Karuna, you mentioned networks as well. Can we build networks of support for women? And Trisha, I was very taken by your let women decide for themselves what they're capable of, because there is a very patronizing agenda for women, but also that we need to work with men and with young boys, you mentioned, to help them to work with women in a more constructive way and to value women's contribution and knowledge. But that working with women can also be a problem. So it's not just the men. And that we're perhaps, we don't put enough store on our own internal resources and the power that we have to bring about change. And women must know what their rights are in order to be able to be active in this world. And finally, just to go back to men acknowledging women's contribution, I love the ideas of mending this from their hearts rather than because they feel they should. So our thought leaders, the Bollywood actors, the sports stars start to stand alongside us. But really the importance of financial independence for women as well is something that we just can't ignore. And I think those are the main points I'd bring out. And I was very struck by an earlier webinar where they were talking about how do we value and protect the rights and interests of our grandchildren. And I think that's something that women particularly take that longer term view. I think, Tamara, you touched on this, that, we tend to take a kind of a generational view of things because often we are mothers, sisters, aunts, grandmothers. So I think those are the points that really struck out for me. But thank you, all of you. What a fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Diana.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.